Thank you all so much for being here. My name is Trent Kittleman. I am the president of the Women's Legislative Caucus this year, and I would like to really tell you that our caucus is wonderful. We were the first caucus in the country, first women's caucus in the country, and we make a very strong effort to be bipartisan. And I can just tell you that I'm a Republican, so you know they're really serious about it because there are not that many of us. So I appreciate the strong effort we put together. The right of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Short and sweet and simple. Today, we take women's suffrage for granted, but at the time, as you might imagine, the issue was very controversial. Suffragettes really suffered. They were ridiculed and called names and worse. It took nearly 100 years to pass the 19th Amendment, and the battle was hard fought. And you will hear a lot about that from our panel in a few moments. But first, I would like to extend a welcome to one of my very favorite people, the First Lady of the state of Maryland, Yumi Hogan.
Good evening. I'm so glad to join the Women's Legislative Caucus to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. Congratulations to Delegate Trent Kittleman and the Women's Legislative Caucus on hosting this wonderful and meaningful event. My husband and I have been proud to partner with the wonderful 19th Amendment Commissions, which has worked so hard to ensure that Maryland gives this important anniversary the honor and the recognition it deserves. Could Senator Catherine Klaas-Myers and Senator Sarah Kagan, Major General Singh, I heard she's not here tonight, right, with us? Yeah, then all the other members of the commission, please stand to be recognized. I would also like to recognize President Ferguson and the Speaker Jones and all the other distinguished guests joining us here tonight. Last month, my husband proclaimed 2020 Year of the Women in Maryland ahead of our year-long celebration of this 100th anniversary. Our state's history has been shaped by so many extraordinary women leaders, and we look forward to many events across the state to commemorate this important milestone. Since first began granted the right to vote in 1920, women have continued to break barriers in every field, including politics. I am honored to be the first Asian American First Lady of the Maryland and to stand here with the women who were also firsts in their field. Major General Singh was Maryland's first African American and the first female Agent General of the Maryland National Guard. And the Speaker Adrienne Jones is the first African American and the first woman to lead the Maryland House Delegate. I had the great pleasure of working with Major General Singh to co-host a special tea to kick off our celebration of the passage of the 19th Amendment at the U.S. Navy Academy Club last June. It is important to celebrate the journey that women have taken since the passage of the 19th Amendment and to recognize those who continue to serve as a role model today. I encourage you all to ask about each other's journeys and share your own. We should always continue to empower each other. I feel honored every day by the opportunities granted to me by my role as the First Lady of the Maryland to support and empower women and girls in our great state. My eyes have been opened to so many of the serious problems facing our communities, and I wanted to do my part to leave this state a better place than when I found it. I have met so many young people with disabilities, victims of domestic violence, struggling single mothers, and the pediatric patients and the countless others facing challenges to their security, well-being, and the success in order for these men and women to be able to use their right to vote and to participate in our government. We have to help meet their basic need first. It was through the art that I became more connected to these communities and more aware of their needs. In 2017, I launched a nonprofit organization for children's art therapy called Yumi Cares. It's not my name. I believe that art can help children find a purpose and a passion in life, leading to the new generations of empowered, powerful young men and women. I plan to continue to work to help children and families in need, to encourage young women and men to be future leaders and role model for others. I feel so blessed to be in a position where I can be a role model to women who aspire to public service, whether they grew up in Maryland or on a chicken farm in South Korea. I truly believe that young women can do anything they put their minds to. I hope that my story, the stories of those in the room, and those stories of the women's suffrage movement can inspire other women to follow their dreams. So as we celebrate the anniversary of women finally getting an official voice in our government, I am thankful to be able to share mine with you. I am excited to keep working alongside all of you to inspire the next generation of female leaders who will change Maryland and the nation for the better. Thank you. Already here, would you like to, House Delegate Trent Kittleman to accept Governor's citation? Citation, Maryland Women's Legislative Caucus. Then this is so small, I have a printout, so bigger. Okay, I read it first, okay? Then greeting, be it known that on behalf of the citizens of this state, in recognition of your dedicated leadership in developing and supporting legislation that assists women and their families in Maryland and your success in encouraging greater participation of women government in honor of the commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, and as an express of our great respect, admiration, and the best wishes for continued success, we are pleased to confer upon you this governor's citation signed by Governor Larry Hogan, Lieutenant Governor Boyd Radford, Secretary of State John Rubin Smith, on January 29, 2020.
And on behalf of the Women's Caucus, I thank you very much. I was lucky to learn early that the secret to doing anything right is to delegate it to somebody who can do it better, and that has been the case this year. We're going to get to the panel, but first, I have a real privilege in introducing two people, and I thank both of them for being here, our brand new leaders. Speaker Jones shattered 2 glass ceilings when she was unanimously elected by the full House of Delegates to serve as the first African American and the first woman speaker in the Maryland's House of Delegates. There are all kinds of things that I could say about her, but I picked out a couple that I particularly liked. She has an honorary law degree from Goucher College in Towson, and she is the mother of 2 and the proud grandmother of 2 wonderful grandchildren, Janelle and Jalen. I always like that. Thank you for being here. President Ferguson, I am so glad. At one point, last session, I think, I was looking at his resume and I said, oh, he taught in Baltimore City. And since I have a real interest in Baltimore City education, I said, I went over, made an appointment, sat down, and I talked with him. And they said, we got a real good talk about Kerwin. And I didn't even realize he was on the Kerwin Commission. So I have a great deal of faith that both of our new leaders are going to be very issue-oriented and going to do good things for this state. President Ferguson was born in Silver Spring, Maryland. Montgomery County won't hold that against you. And graduated from Davidson College with a double major in political science and economics in 2005. And then he taught 2 years in a Baltimore City school. Served as a community liaison on educational issues for the president of the Baltimore City Council. And from 2009 to 2010, he was a special assistant to Andres Alonso, chief executive of the Baltimore City Schools. And with that, Speaker Jones, will you come on up and speak?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. In a century, women went from being told we can't play. We were told we can't play the game and calling the shots. 100 years of strength, resilience, and sacrifice from extraordinary women propelled to the positions of leadership and transformed American politics. The first time I cast my vote for a woman was for who is now the state senator, Dolores Kelly. She was everything you wanted in a legislature: strategic, fearless, and intuitive with the needs, in tune with the needs of the community. When casting my vote, I knew I made a difference. There is nothing more empowering than to say that a woman is the best person for the job and have your voice be heard. When I step into a voting booth or step onto the House floor, I know that the decision I make then and there will impact the lives of women 100 years from now. No doubt, we've made some mistakes. We made some strides. Our Women's Caucus is 72 strong. We make up 38% of Maryland's legislature. Over half of our House committees are chaired by women. And the Speaker Pro Tem and entire Pro Tem team are women. We're making decisions that directly impact women, Some are small but impactful, like adding additional restrooms and a room for nursing mothers in the State House. But we have larger, significant decisions to make. Women are still fighting for equal pay, fighting to protect their reproductive rights, and fighting to shatter more glass ceilings. It is up to us to finish the work the suffragettes started. I'm so grateful for the women who came before us. More than that, I'm grateful for the women among us. Thank you.
I have to start actually with an apology to Chairwoman Trent Kittleman. This morning I was supposed to address the Women's Caucus, and I had to reschedule. But in a testament to the progress that's been made over the last 100 years, it was due to my wife calling last night and saying, "I've got an early morning meeting. You got to make sure that you walk the kids to school." So this morning, I apologize for not being there and look forward to speaking with the Women's Caucus at a subsequent event. I was standing at Hampstead Hill Academy handing off the 5- and 7-year-old to make sure that Leah could make that morning meeting on time. So I appreciate your accommodating me, but it is a small little example of how things have changed and the culture and nature of who we are as people, that it's almost unimaginable that there was a moment where women couldn't vote. And I think it's really incredibly important in moments like these to think about that, because it's easy to forget the progress that's been made. I do want to make sure to say a very special thank you to Senator Kathy Klausmeier, who has been talking about this date and this year for probably the last, I would say, at least 6 to 8 years, noting that, this year is the 100th anniversary. And, it's one of those things that you would hear over and over again. But then as it's here, it just really strikes you that this is truly a moment that matters. For those history buffs out there, is anyone aware of when was the first time a woman voted in Maryland? There's got to be at least one history buff out here. Everyone's saying after 1920, right? That would be incorrect, apparently. The first woman to vote was May 19th, 1900, here in the capital city of Annapolis. And it was women in Annapolis who were granted the ability as taxpayers and landowners to vote in the municipal bond election starting in 1900, and for each bond election that point forward. Of course, it wasn't until 1920 that women were provided the right to vote on both federal and state elections. And what's interesting is in between that 1900 and 1920 is the division that ended up happening amongst passionate advocates. There were women's groups who believed deeply that the focus and the fight should be on Maryland. We should fight for the General Assembly to pass a piece of state legislation, start the movement, show success, and take it to the feds. There was the other side of the coin that said, no, don't waste our energy on Maryland. We have to get this done federally. Until we have the right to vote at the federal level, we'll never be able to make progress in the states. And as these two groups were seemingly divided, it's funny to think back now, 100 years, it wasn't one or the other that ended up making the difference. It was both. And I'm sure in that moment when there was this division at the time between 1900 and 1920, there were deep, impassioned beliefs about the best way to get to the place where everyone wanted to go. And I say this because that struggle that happened then is happening today. And the question I think that is so relevant for all of us as we look at the next 100 years is, what is the issue that our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren will have the opportunity in 2020 to say, that was the fight that we made happen. That's the opportunity that we have. And I think the best justice that we can do for recognizing the incredible strides that have been made, we have 15 unbelievable female senators and Republicans and Democrats who are fighting every day, not just for women's issues, but all of our issues. And it is a testament to that progress that the road ahead is even brighter than what we have seen thus far. I want to say thank you all for giving me this opportunity to celebrate with you. It is always such an honor. I more and more have the opportunity to say thank you, Madam Speaker, at following in these events. It's a testament. And the day that we will really have known that the progress is truly here is that when it won't be remarkable. It will just be how things are. We're getting there. We're not there yet, but the fight continues. Thank you all. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you both so much. Now I want to turn the program over to the two women who actually made this happen. About a year ago, I can permission to use a delegate's name. Karen Young came to me and said, do you know that next year is the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment? And knowing that I was going to be the president in this year, and I said, no, I didn't know that, but that's exciting. So we got a real good start on it. Then when Brooke Learman came in and had a similar interest, I asked them both to chair the committee to make this happen, and they did a wonderful job. And I'd like to invite them up here to introduce our speakers.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening. This is really the first in a series of events to celebrate the centennial anniversary of the 19th Amendment. We're going to be introducing a variety of people that will be joining us a little bit later, but I want to give a shout out to a very special woman that's here tonight who researched, designed, and developed these sashes. Some of you are probably wondering, what are these sashes for? What do they mean? What are the significance of them? As I started researching what actually happened 100 years ago, I noticed these yellow sashes that the women wore. And I wanted to have them reproduced and have them historically correct. So I knew who to go to, a seamstress and a small business owner in Frederick by the name of Joni Jenkins. Joni, raise your hand, please. She also teaches young women how to sew so that they have a trade and a skill. And she spent endless hours talking with the Enoch Pratt Library, making sure that the design, the materials, everything down to the pin was historically correct. So please enjoy them, and we'll be wearing them again. Thanks.
And now I'm so pleased to turn it over to a leader in the House, Jocelyn, our friend, Delegate Jocelyn Pena-Melnick, who is going to introduce the next speaker. And we're just thrilled that you all could join us tonight. It's a special year. It's not a subject without complications. And I'm really excited to hear from our speakers tonight about all the great things and some of the not so great things that happened in 1920. So, but without further ado, Delegate Pena-Melnick.
Thank you. Good evening. How are you? Thank you so much for coming, and thank you, ladies. This is a lot of work. It takes a lot of work to put an event together. So I also want to just say I removed mine because inside there's a little label that says "Vote for Women, Suffragette Sash," and then it has her name, Joni Jenkins, 2020, so that we can preserve them. So that was very neat. Thank you. So I have the honor and the pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Nicholas Redding. He's the Executive Director of Preservation Maryland. Nicholas has led the organization since 2014, and among his many accomplishments, he worked in partnership with the National Park Service on campaign for historic trades to increase opportunities for all Americans to enter the trades and help restore the nation's irreplaceable heritage. We're very grateful to him and to Preservation Maryland for sharing their expertise with us, including lending us the wonderful panels that you see to your left, right there. If you're not able to look at them tonight, We have them on display on the second floor of this building. And you should look at them because they have a lot of history and it was a lot of work to put them together. With that, let me turn the mic over to Nicholas and he will introduce the panel. My pleasure.
So it really is a pleasure and a distinct honor to be here with all of you tonight. I'm the executive director of Preservation Maryland, and we were founded back in 1931. And I was trying to think and put that in context, and that's just 11 years after women secured the right to vote, or put it another way, 11 years after Maryland rejected the 19th Amendment, which they did in February of 1920. And though our organization has changed in many ways since our founding back 89 years ago, we remain dedicated to preserving the story of all Marylanders. And today that work embraces an inclusive and diverse history from the Civil War to civil rights, from suffrage to the protecting places now where LGBTQ history was made across the state. And to accomplish that work, we fund, advocate, educate, and train now the next generation of historic tradespeople in our new workforce development program. And we envision a Maryland where our past is used to create a just and prosperous future. And oftentimes making that case for history can be a difficult thing. It's something that my life work has been dedicated to. But tonight, looking out over a sea of women legislators, that case is obvious. You're the future for which suffragists fought 100 years ago. This room is the just reward of their toil. This room, its legislators, the energy, the promise of this session was the dream for which they clamored, something they cried and bled for. You're the living, breathing reminder of the power of history 100 years on. And if anything, I hope that tonight's event is a reminder that you carry their dreams with you in every vote you take and in every ballot you receive. Tonight, I also have the pleasure of introducing our speakers and our moderator, who will be going in depth on this most important and momentous occasion. Tonight's moderator is a voice we'll probably all be very familiar with. Sheilah Kast is the host of WYPR's On the Record. She began her career at the Washington Star, where she covered the Maryland and Virginia legislatures, as well as financial, banking, energy, taxes, utilities. She learned the craft of broadcasting at ABC News as a Washington correspondent. She's covered the White House, Congress, the breakup of the Soviet Union. She has been a substitute on NPR's Weekend Edition and the Diane Rehm Show. Joining Sheilah are two fantastic experts on suffrage history in Maryland and beyond. Professor Martha Jones is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor of History at the Johns Hopkins University. She is a legal and cultural historian whose work examines how Black Americans have shaped the American democracy. She holds a PhD in history from Columbia and a JD from the SUNY School of Law. And prior to the start of her academic career, she was a public interest litigator in New York City. She currently serves as the president of the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians and on the executive board of the Organization of American Historians. And also joining us this evening is Elaine Weiss. Elaine is an award-winning journalist and writer. Her magazine feature rating has been recognized with prizes from the Society of Professional Journalists, and her byline has appeared in The Atlantic, Harper's, New York Times, Boston Globe, Philadelphia Inquirer, and beyond. She's a frequent correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor, and her latest book, The Woman's Hour, The Great Fight to Win the Vote, has received critical acclaim and was recently optioned by Steven Spielberg for an upcoming television series. Elaine lives in Baltimore and with her husband, Julian Krolik, who's a professor of astrophysics at Johns Hopkins. And when she's not writing or this year speaking, you hopefully can find her on the Chesapeake Bay. And for this audience, most importantly, she votes in every election. We are so pleased to be a part of this, to have been able to provide these panels, and to have had the opportunity to introduce these fantastic speakers and our moderator for tonight's discussion. Thank you.
Again, I'm Sheilah Kast, and I thank Nick for the introductions, and I just have to say, when he told me that this event was going to take place and that I might be able to talk to them again. I've interviewed both of them on my show. I was like so excited because I cannot think of any two people who are better versed in this topic, have more insights about what it means, what it has meant, and what it will mean to us. Just two people who are so smart about this. So I am grateful to Preservation Maryland and grateful to the Women's Legislative Caucus for calling us together and organizing this event. Before, I want to make 2 points. When we had a phone meeting to talk about what we would like to do, 2 points that came from Elaine and Martha. One was they both said that we should hear from the legislators and other legislatively focused people who are here. They want questions. And so I am not going to hog all the time. I will stop it after a few questions and invite yours. So be thinking of what you want to ask. And we have a mic here so you can come to the mic and everyone can hear your question. The other point was that while we're all here to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, both of these experts said this is not all about triumph. There is a lot of work left to do. As Speaker Jones said, it's up to us to finish the work the suffragettes started. And so that's part of what we intend to discuss. And so let's get to it. Elaine, I want to ask you to situate us. What should this group in particular know about what led to Congress passing the 19th Amendment in June of 1919 and sending it to the states? What was the dynamic that pushed it to that point?
I want to give you an idea of what happened before. I think in a lot of history books, suffrage is given very short shrift, women's suffrage, and it's usually portrayed as, women began talking about this in 1848. Of course, they've been talking about it long before, but at the Seneca Falls Convention, and they demanded the vote. And then in 1920, they were given the vote. And that's usually how it's portrayed. And I want to tell you that was not how it happened. And so, as you know, the states hold the legal and political control of deciding who of their citizens are eligible to vote. So states are in control of voting laws. And so the first thought was to get the states to try to change the laws. And this usually meant changing the constitution of the state, because many of them said in the Constitution it would be white men. And so changing that was the first thrust of the suffrage movement. And they begin agitating, I think Kansas is the first referendum. So it can be done in several ways, legislative action, but often the Constitution of the states would say, well, legislative action, but then it has to be affirmed by a referendum. Of course, only men could vote in the referendum. So it meant that this question would be on the ballot. Should women in whatever state it was have the right to vote? And it was, for the most part, voted down. Now, there were exceptions in the western states, and we can deal with that later. There are states who, for their own reasons, some of it wonderfully idealistic, some of it commercial or political, decide that women should be able to vote. And so that begins, of course, Wyoming comes into the Union as a territory who has already allowed women to vote, and then Utah and Colorado is the first state to have a referendum where the men actually decide to vote. So this kind of percolates, but it's very slow. And it's clear in the southern states, but not just the southern states, but in the Northeast and in the Middle Atlantic. When there are referenda, or when is proposed to the legislatures that women be able to vote, it's voted down. And so it becomes obvious, and there were also many other angles. They tried through the courts through Supreme Court test cases to try to get the courts to say women under the 14th Amendment as citizens should be able to have the right to vote. And Susan B. Anthony and Sojourner Truth actually vote in the 1872 election. Susan Anthony is arrested, tried, and convicted of illegal voting in a federal election. So it becomes clear that they're not going to be able to use the courts, that the states are going very slowly, and for the most part, there will be many states who will never allow women to vote. How do you supersede this? A federal amendment. So it's introduced into Congress in 1878, and it's stalled there for 40 years. 40 years. And every year, the suffragists would go up and make their very legal claims and give testimony to whatever committee was hearing it. And at one point, Elizabeth Stanton writes in her journal, in her memoirs, that she had to hold herself back from throwing her manuscript at the chairman's head, sorry for any chair here, because of the men were not listening. They were polishing their shoes or sharpening their pencils. They weren't listening. So this goes on for 40 years. Finally, it does emerge after World War I, after women have served in that war in capacities that they had never done before. And it becomes harder and harder, and there was protests, and there's a lot of political pressure. It comes out of the states, comes out of Congress, and is then sent to the states to ratify. It's an off year for states, though. In many states, most states, in fact, only met every other year, or like Maryland, had a very 3 or 4 months of being in session. And the Senate knew what they were doing in sending it out on an off year. So they were going to have to ask 30 governors to call special extraordinary sessions. They had to do that before they could even deal with the legislatures. So that's what's happened in 1920. And by the summer of 1920, 35 states have ratified. They need 36, or 3/4 of the 48 states in the Union, and just one more is needed. Maryland, which never agreed to have a referendum for suffrage, also rejected the amendment. I think we're coming up on the anniversary. I see on those great panels, it's February 17th, 1920, by an overwhelming margin.
And I want to get more into that. But Martha Jones, I want to ask you, African-American women had been advocating for most of a century by the time Congress finally passed the amendment. Tell us about their fight, because it was really in many ways on a separate track from what white suffragists were doing.
We began the evening hearing about extraordinary women's firsts here in the state of Maryland. But I'll take us back to 1832 in the city of Boston, and a figure by the name of Maria Stewart, who begins life very simply as something like an indentured servant in Connecticut. A young African-American woman migrates to Boston, and by 1832 is going to be the very first American woman to speak at a podium publicly on the subject of politics. And this moment, for me, really embodies the beginning of not simply African-American women's firsts in the nation's politics, but Stewart asks some very pointed questions of audiences, black and white, men and women, about who African-American women are, who they should be, who they might be in the nation's body politic. Stewart is most concerned with the issue of slavery, of course. She's an anti-slavery advocate, She's deeply interested in civil rights. By 1832 in Massachusetts, slavery has long been abolished, but civil rights are still not quite within full reach for African Americans. And she really launches Black women into a long saga of defining their particular place in our body politic and a recognition that in those struggles, both, if you will, sexism and racism are always intertwined companion struggles, that any political movement that Black women will participate in, any movement that they will build and lead, must speak to those two concerns simultaneously.
I tend to have a hard time, I think, keeping the sweep of history in the way events that I think of separately connect. We're talking about a debate early in the 20th century that was just over half a century after the end of the Civil War, just about a half century since Congress had passed and the states had ratified the 15th Amendment, which, at least on paper, gave African American men the right to vote. Either or both of you talk to me about how that played into the debate over the 19th Amendment.
I can start, yeah. So one of the things that's so important and really so profound to think about is the women's suffrage movement grows out of the abolition movement in many ways. They are sibling causes through the Civil War. So the women we think of as the foremothers, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan Anthony and Lucretia Mott and Lucy Stone, they start their careers as abolition workers. That is their first political involvement, and they are professionals at it. They are actually professional abolition workers. And that idea of all human beings having the divine spark and having a personhood and should be given freedom and given rights comes out of the abolition movement. It's both. If you think of it, I mean, women often said, you know, we have no rights. Slaves certainly have no rights. We have no rights. And so there is this sort of mutual understanding that it is an intersectional kind of movement. And one of the things that I find so moving, and I describe that in detail, is that at Seneca Falls, when Elizabeth Stanton makes her first public announcement, says, besides urging that women be paid equally to men, 1848, yes, even then it was an issue. She also says that we should have the franchise. And most of the people there totally disagree, that it's just too much to ask for the franchise. And it's Frederick Douglass who is there, who stands up. He's only 10 years out of slavery in Maryland. And he stands up, and it's he who convinces the others in the Wesley Chapel to accept Stanton's Resolution Number 9, as it was called. So it's Frederick Douglass who convinces them and says, for the same reason, the vote will never be given to you and it will never be given to me without a fight. And so it's very clear. What happens after, in the Reconstruction era, is when the 14th and 15th Amendments are proposed, the women are left behind. And they're told it's not the woman's hour. And Frederick Douglass is heartbroken about it, but he says, we need the vote. Black men need the vote. It's a matter of life and death for us. And so there is a rift at that point, and race will become intertwined in all the arguments, especially here in Maryland, when that rejection, I should tell you, is because Maryland does not want Black women to vote.
I said it's so important to revisit these stories, and I think I might take another pass because we might ask where African American women were in July of 1848 when Stanton, Douglass, Mott and others gather at Seneca Falls. No evidence that African American women were there. So where were they? And part of what we now know is that African American women are indeed organizing around their power. They are scheming about their rights, but not in Seneca Falls. It turns out for African American women in 1848, one of the most vital places in which they feel compelled to level claims about women's rights, to vote, to hold office, is in their churches. And so African American women, in the spring of 1848, women, part of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, are in Philadelphia. And they are scheming with male allies to get their question on the table. They want preaching licenses. They want to become equal with men in what was arguably the most powerful of Black institutions, the Black church. So when we tell the story of the origins, part of our work, it turns out, is to follow women where they were, rather than asking why they were absent someplace else.
Do you agree with Elaine's analysis that the movement became all tied up with race, especially in Maryland?
Yeah, I was thinking as Elaine was talking, I think it's this coming week is 150 years since ratification of the 15th Amendment. And I'm struck, frankly, that in this year where we will gather, Elaine and I are going to gather a lot together, and many of you will, to mark the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, many fewer of us will mark 150 years since the 15th Amendment. And yet, I would say, African American women, suffragists that they are, understand that their route to the vote, their route to political power, depends on both, right, the 15th and the 19th Amendment, and the enforcement of the two. And it is true that some of the most, for my thinking, some of the most fraught moments before the 19th Amendment comes out of Congress are those in which, say in 1914, you have lawmakers who stand on the floor of the Senate and propose a bargain. And that bargain is repeal the 15th Amendment and we'll give you women's suffrage. So Black women suffragists are grappling still with the legacy and the fragility of the principles embodied in the 15th Amendment and the 14th too, while there is this twisted promise being offered up to U.S. senators, and many Southern senators will accept that bargain even as it ultimately fails.
And one of the threats made when it was being decided in the Senate, which the House actually passed it almost 18 months before, and the Senate held back. And in that last debate, the last day before it finally passes in the U.S. Senate, there are amendments that will change the wording and just make it white women. That's at the very end. That's like the day that it gets voted on. Make it just white women. One of the things, talking about the legacy of the 15th Amendment, is when it comes down to the southern states, and my book is about what happens in Tennessee, that last state, and you see all the arguments, you see all the fights that happened around the country, but especially in the South. And they bring up, this is another version of the 14th and the 15th Amendments. And do you want the federal government to be able to tell us who can be in that ballot box? We didn't like the 14th Amendment, we didn't like the 15th Amendment, and we're not going to like the 19th Amendment. And they also worry that because in the southern states, the 15th Amendment has been subverted by Jim Crow laws, so Black men are not voting in the southern states. They're intimidated, they're being killed, they're being suppressed by many means. And basically in the southern states, they say, well, look, if we pass this 19th Amendment, which is based on the wording of the 15th Amendment, this is going to encourage Washington to look into our state and realize we're not enforcing the 15th Amendment. And this could put us in a lot of jeopardy because technically Congress has the enforcement power. It's always that second section, Congress shall have the power to enforce this amendment, and they don't. So they're worried. One of the arguments against ratification is it'll open up the southern states to scrutiny, and everyone will realize that they have not been enforcing the 14th or 15th Amendments. So it really is an issue right to the end.
Was there also a concern in some of the southern states that the tactics they were using against African American men voting, they couldn't use those same tactics against women?
Well, they were lynching men, but it turned out, and they thought that it would be bad PR if they were lynching women, but it turns out that didn't bother them in the end.
But there's no question, right, that poll taxes and literacy tests, understanding clauses are all aimed at African American women. And part of what we know in the years and months leading up to the ratification of the amendment is that Black women are organizing through their clubs to do citizenship education that will prepare communities of women to come to the registrar, to confront officials and overcome those kinds of hurdles. In the early fall of 1920, when we look over the newspapers, particularly Democratic Party newspapers, what we see are the urgings directed at white women voters to register, to turn out, because the fear is that white women won't turn out, that they are ambivalent, reluctant about suffrage, and that African American women will step into that void and not only overtake white women at the polls, but really tip the balance of party power in many places to the Republican Party.
In fact, may I read a little? This is actually the rationale that Maryland was using. So not only, I hate to tell you, not only did Maryland reject the 19th Amendment, but it sent emissaries to all the other southern states to convince them to reject it. And one of the men who had been the leader, there was a group of lawyers around the country called the American Constitutional League. They always take those kind of names. William Marbury, which is a big name in Baltimore, a famous lawyer, and he wrote a letter. He had mobilized opposition in the State House here to ratification, and now he wrote to the Tennessee governor, who is deciding whether to call a special election. And this is what he writes. It seems monstrous to us here in Maryland, especially those of us who are Democrats, that the legislature of Tennessee should vote to ratify an amendment which would take away for us the right to determine this question for ourselves. Adoption of the amendment would harm Marylanders even more seriously than Tennesseans, adding 60 to 70,000 Negro women voters to the electorate. And while the Negro women would be eager to exercise their new franchise on Election Day, white women would be reluctant to go to the polls due to, quote, the conditions which would exist in the state, which means integrated polling places. So white women might not want to go there if Black women were able to vote. And that's the kind of rationale that was being used. So in fact, the president of the Senate of Maryland shows up in Nashville and sits with the anti-suffrage legislators to convince them. It hurt me when I read that. But yes, it is really all about, especially in a democratic state, which you have to kind of switch your gears. They were not progressive, especially on racial matters at that time. And so they are worried that, especially black women will vote for the party of Lincoln. They will vote for the Republicans, which was true.
Where were most women in the country, and if we know women in Maryland, black and white, in terms of their attitude toward the 19th Amendment? I mean, we know there were suffragettes. We know that there were women passionately committed, but were they typical of most women's attitudes?
I think one way to take the temperature, if you will, among African American women is to look at the debates within the National Association of Colored Women, which is the premier suffrage organization, though hardly a single issue organization, but it is the place in which black women vote and advocate around the suffrage. And there are certainly black women who are tepid and reluctant about the 19th Amendment. There is, not unique to African American women, but certainly running through black women's politics and culture, a long-standing concern that becoming too embroiled in politics, the mess, the subterfuge, and more. I don't have to tell you all about politics. But there is a spoken concern about the degree to which African American women might compromise themselves or sacrifice their tenuous hold on ladyship or womanhood in a full citizen sense in the United States. Booker T. Washington's wife, Margaret Murray Washington, from Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, will mix it up with suffragists like Mary Church Terrell in Washington, D.C., over the direction of the National Association and how hard they should press for suffrage. Her compromise is to say, let's stay out of the fray when it comes to the 19th Amendment, but at the same time, let's prepare ourselves so that if and when the 19th Amendment is ratified, we are ready to go to the polls and pass those literacy tests and those understanding clauses and to step into this new role. So there's no question but that there is something risky for African American women who, at any moment in this period, when they put themselves in the public eye, be it in politics or in church or culture, in the social world, open themselves up to outright denigration, ridicule, to racism. And so even if we might not agree with Margaret Murray Washington, I think her caution and her concern is one that is understood and shared by many women who understand that to step to the podium in politics. I mentioned Maria Stewart in 1832. What I didn't tell you is by 1833, she's been run out of Boston practically on a rail because the fact of an African-American woman standing at the podium and speaking about politics is repugnant to Bostonians, black and white, men and women. So this has been a long, risky trail for black women, and it's no less risky in 1920 than it had been in 1820.
Yeah, I think I totally agree. And what's important for us to realize is, we're wearing this sashes, and you see those wonderful photographs of the marches, but I think we have to understand that the suffragists were derided. They were held in contempt. It was not easy. You had to have a thick skin. You had to be brave to stand up publicly. And again, it was considered promiscuous. That was the word. Promiscuous for a woman to speak in public. How our words change. And they were pelted with rotten eggs. Susan Anthony used to say that she could mark the progress of the movement by the projectiles that were thrown at her. And when they were no longer rotten eggs, they were just regular eggs. Well, that was progress. And, Susan Anthony is going into the black churches in the South and trying to convince black women that it's worth this risk, which it's much riskier for them. But I just want to give you the sense that it was not easy for white suffragists either. They were not applauded for their bravery. They were really ridiculed. And sometimes in their own clubs, in their churches, their pastor would be fulminating from the pulpit and saying, this is wrong, this goes against God's plan. So I think we have to realize that, I think black women are also watching how white women are being treated too.
And yet, and we haven't even talked about, and I'm not going to take time to ask you about the commercial interests like the railroads and the liquor companies that didn't want women to have the vote. Within a little more than a year, 35 states did ratify. And come the summer of 20, Tennessee was on the verge of being the 36th state, the state that would ratify. Why so many states with all this opposition that you've laid out?
Political organizing. That's why. The suffragists had done an extraordinary job of organizing in every state. And they'd been doing this for decades. And so they knew who their friends were, who their enemies were in the state houses. They all had opposition research files. You can actually visit some of those in Washington. The Women's Party had them. The National American had them. They knew every state legislator, where and they were all women, all men, of course, where the skeletons were buried, who their funders were, if they had a problem with drinking. They had all that information, and they used it if they could. So they had learned politics, and they could turn out crowds of women. In Connecticut, where the governor actually never called a session, they brought in 50 women from every state. And these were professors and doctors and lawyers. They flew, well, they took the trains. They came in and rallied in Hartford. They brought extraordinary pressure to bear on the state levels, and they knew how to do it. And they'd also made friends among the legislators. And there were really, genuinely, male legislators who believed this was just and right, and it was time. It was due to the political organizing of decades that finally, I think, proved to turn it so quickly.
So I promised not to hog the time. So let me ask just one more question before I open it up. And that is, what would you focus on? What would you focus us on? The unfinished business of the fight that you've been describing. What is the unfinished work of the suffragettes, as Speaker Jones said?
I've been wrestling in these weeks, knowing this year would be upon us and I'd be sitting in a chair like this, and wrestling with that kind of juxtaposition of the 15th versus the 19th Amendment and this anniversary year. And so one of the things I want to offer is that if we reframe the struggle for women's suffrage and we lose what might be a somewhat antiquarian, peculiar term, suffrage, my students misunderstand it, right? And you know why. If we let go of the term suffrage and we understood that when we visit the 19th Amendment and the struggles for it, its ratification and its consequences, we're visiting one episode, an important one, in a longer saga of voting rights in the United States. I think we begin to see how to connect the dots from this moment all the way to our own. If I use a term like voter suppression to describe what African American women confront after the summer of 1920, I think you hear the call, right? The unfinished business. And at least for the women I write about, certainly, there's no question that the 19th Amendment, for some, it is a victory. For many, it is a disappointment. But it is merely a stop on a longer road to realizing voting rights, one that will take us certainly to 1965 and the passage of the Voting Rights Act in that year. But it might take us to lawmakers like Georgia Stacey Abrams, and ongoing challenges that we face around, dare I say, not giving, but guaranteeing to all American citizens the right to vote. That work, I think, is not yet complete. Not yet complete.
Yeah, and just to amplify that in my own ways is the sense that this, what we call the suffrage movement, the voting rights movement to get women the right to vote, is a civil rights struggle. It is for women to be full citizens. They are not full citizens. And I think what we have to look, when we look at the whole span of America creating a democracy, a government by and for the people, and the preamble opens, "We the people," and yet, from the very beginning, we restrict that ability to have a voice in government. So what does that say about we as a nation? What does it say that we are still restricting it? That this went on, that the 15th Amendment was not enough because it wasn't enforced. The 19th Amendment was not enough because it wasn't enforced. The Voting Rights Act, which was so powerful and gave finally a legal tool to win back the rights that had already been given, has now been eviscerated. So what do we as a nation, what should we be looking at? Luckily, in Maryland, voting rights are not in jeopardy in the same way as when I travel to Indiana or Ohio or Tennessee or Georgia, where the state is celebrating, has a commission, is celebrating the centennial of women's suffrage, and yet is slashing voting rights in that same state house today. And I think we need to take a really hard look at what do we mean as a democracy. We send our military we've fought wars to defend democracy, and yet, as Alice Paul asks at the gate of the White House, democracy needs to begin at home. And I think we need to look at voting rights not as a partisan issue, but as a stress test of our democracy. And until we do that and see it in this broader sense of what our nation stands for, then that can always be chipped away in some way and explained away as party politics, that it'll help one party and hurt another one. And I think we need to look at it much more broadly. And also the participation. It's one thing to have the rights. It's another that participation in our elections is very poor. And that needs to be improved too. And I think education and advocacy is the way to do that. But we have to use that right. And the percentages in Maryland are okay, but they're not great. And young people are not voting in the numbers they should be. So there's a lot of work to be done in that way too, of actually making this democracy work. And the League of Women Voters was started out of the suffrage movement. Carrie Chapman Catt starts it as an educational resource, as a place where new citizens, not just women, but also immigrant men, can learn how to be American, can learn how to vote, and learn what the issues are. Making democracy work is really the goal that we should be moving towards, I think.
Who has a question? Who wants to get into this conversation? And maybe identify yourself.
Yes, B. Ditzler, Legal Women Voters. And I have a question, please, and that is about the urban-rural divide, and if there was a big difference in how Maryland viewed that or advocated, if you had more suffragettes on the urban side or the rural side, or how it worked.
I'm not sure I have that information. I have not broken down it that way. That was beyond my purview. So I'm afraid I probably cannot answer that. But I will tell you that the urban rural divide was a little more complicated and interesting in that the Grange was one of the big supporters of women's suffrage early on. So it's not, I don't think we can think of it in the same way as we think of politics today. The Grange and farm women were very supportive. So I have a feeling that it's not going to break the way we might imagine it does, but I don't have full information on that.
I was wondering if you could provide some examples of what voter suppression looks like today, because I don't know that everybody in the room would understand that maybe the same way, particularly how asking for a voter ID works to suppress votes. So it does provide some examples about what Ohio was doing, what Georgia is doing, among other states.
It's a
Litany of
harrowing
shame.
litany, which is to say, of course, voter ID requirements, which disproportionately impact some parts of our communities. The closing and the shuffling of polling places, right, which makes voting more burdensome, more confusing for many voters. We've just watched a battle in the state of Florida over felon disfranchisement, give with one hand and take with the other. That is to say, the lifting of felon disfranchisement and then the imposition of what some have called a poll tax, requiring former felons to pay exorbitant, right, impossible fees before they can again exercise the right to vote.
Right.
Maybe you want to add to that.
No,
That's
I was
my
thinking
walk
that,
of shame.
yeah, it is a bucket of shame. And again, there was a case in the 2018 election, I guess, in I'm going to forget the state, but in a Native American community where they moved the polling place, and also did not allow them to use as an address a post office box, and that's how everyone gets the mail. So there are lots of different ways, and even here, I often go out and campaign in an election, and on election day, I may be in Virginia or in Pennsylvania, because thankfully Maryland is not considered in jeopardy. And so I will see, it looks like a fine, okay, and the line is 3 hours long because they've only put one machine in. And it's a minority neighborhood. And working people can't wait that long. We have early voting. Many states do not. So there's lots of subtler ways that don't usually get, called voter suppression, but it is because you're making voting harder and also targeting it often at minority communities. So I would say, yeah, there's a lot of it going on, and I'm really glad, Stacey Abrams and others are standing up and saying, this is wrong, this is not democratic.
So my name's Elizabeth Hughes. I'm the director of the Maryland Historical Trust, and we've been funding a lot of documentation of sites across Maryland associated with the women's suffrage movement using state grant funds approved by the Maryland General Assembly, so thank you very much, as well as from the National Park Service. And so one of the things that I think I found really fascinating that I didn't understand going into this, reading the Maryland Suffrage magazine from the early 20th century, was how strategic these women were in planning things like the Margaret Brent pilgrimage, going from Baltimore City down to St. Mary's City and back in a covered wagon to get attention, the Garrett County pilgrimage, walking to talk to the farmers so they would come out and, gain members for the Just Government League and so forth. And they were so incredibly thoughtful about planning their PR campaigns. I'm wondering, was that something that came out of their experience with the abolition movement or World War I, or where was this understanding of how to manipulate the media, create a public spectacle to get attention for their initiative? Where did that come from?
Those were often discussed at national conventions, and there would be workshops on how to get information. You should have a publication if you can. So it's not that it comes top down, because you have to have, as anyone who's been on a committee, a volunteer committee, knows, you have to have willing souls to do the work. But how to do it and what the best strategies are, and how to start a newspaper, how to do a fundraising campaign, often would be at the national conventions. And of course, there is a national convention that takes place in 1906 in Baltimore. And that is the place, it is Susan Anthony's last convention. She dies just a few weeks later. And it's the place where she is speaking to the young college students, to the Goucher students and the Hood students. And she's talking to them, and they're members of the suffrage league of their college and some of the high schools. And she says to them, I feel good giving the movement over to you with young people like you failure is impossible. That's where it comes from. It's actually said in Baltimore. Launched 1,000 tote bags, but it's actually in Baltimore, and she's talking to the next generation.
Yeah, I think I would just add, that what I heard in your question was sort of a reference to some of the political theater that I think really characterizes this movement. And I've been thinking a lot about, of course, Alice Paul's 1913 parade, but among African Americans, the parade has a long tradition by the time we get to the 20th century, going back to celebrations, the occupying of the streets to mark the end of the international slave trade, to mark abolition, to mark the 15th Amendment, to mark the Civil War and the memory of the Civil War. And so Black and white women both come out of traditions of political theater, and I think really hone this skill in a way that I think makes it feel very familiar standing in the 21st century when we think about the ways in which political movements, even today, engage in this kind of occupying the streets and the public space and using imagery, performance, farce, all of those things to persuade, to cajole, even all the way up to ACT UP and the activism around HIV and AIDS. I think is part of that long story of political theater.
That's right, and getting arrested.
Yeah,
getting arrested.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm Holly Joseph, and I'm in a number of organizations who can all disavow me if they don't like my points. But the first point I'd like to make is I learned so much from Elaine's book, The Woman's Hour, and I recommend that you read it. The point I would like to share with you is how perilously close suffrage was not to be voted in. Okay, do you get that? Second point was that where we have to go now, there's so many parallels between that and the Equal Rights Amendment. Alice Paul said voting was not enough, that greater rights had to be forwarded. And today, I don't know how many of you know that this is the Lilly Ledbetter anniversary of the Lilly Ledbetter Act. Legislation had to be passed to say that equal pay for equal worth. If you don't think women are equal, why are you going to be concerned about equal pay, women's health, et cetera, et cetera? I'll say no more about that. But the one other thing is I just happened to read the 14th Amendment, and I just challenge anyone reading the 14th Amendment. You mentioned the 15th. It wouldn't have been necessary had the 14th been observed. So it's another compelling case to say we've got to stand up and insist on the laws that are on the books and that they be enforced. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you.
Do you want to comment?
I'm just going to thank you for that opening. You weren't a plant, but this was something we had talked about when we met offline. Which is that indeed, read the 14th Amendment. It does many things, but one of the things it does is provide that any state which deprives a population within it from the vote should suffer a loss of representation in the Congress. This has never been enforced. And yet, I think my view is that in an era of voter suppression, seemingly unchecked voter suppression in many parts of this country, what would happen if we invoked that section of the 14th Amendment and now began to penalize those states that kept citizens, men and women, from voting in important numbers? How would states respond if they had to suffer a loss of representation?
I'm so glad.
We don't have to change any laws.
Right.
To do that. That already exists in the text of the 14th Amendment, even as it has never been enforced.
Yep.
It's never been enforced. Has anyone ever sued under that?
It has been. There have been several times. I actually wrote an essay about this, because I really think that this it could have been the key. You wouldn't have needed the Voting Rights Act if it had. We could have. In fact, in Tennessee and through the southern states and in Maryland, they worry that one of the reasons they don't want the federal government looking at their lack of enforcement of the 14th, 15th Amendment is that they will lose representation in Congress. And they actually have charts showing how many congressmen will be lost by each southern state. So they're very aware of it. And it becomes one of the reasons that they say, let's not mess with this, because they're going to come looking at our books, basically. So yeah,
I think we have to wrap up. I want to. We can take 2 more questions. 2 more questions. Okay, you're on.
All right. Hi, I'm Jenna. I'm a staffer here. And Elaine, thank you for your book. I actually just read it for a graduate course that started this week. We all love it. What struck me the most when I was reading it was how overtly racist so many of the white suffragists were willing to get, just their rhetoric so overtly racist. So that class is all about memory and commemoration and how we're commemorating the suffrage movement. So how do we commemorate appropriately what this white suffragist did while still keeping in mind how overtly racist they were? And that might be a graduate school question, but
no, but it's an important one.
You know, we've been watching these images flash, and there's a great slide of that includes figures like Ida Wells and Sojourner Truth. Not sure it'll come back up, but you've been seeing that, and my question might be, why don't we embrace these women as Nannie Helen Burroughs, Anna Julia Cooper, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper? Why don't we as 21st century American women embrace these suffragists as our foremothers? Why is there a color line in our memory? Which is to say, these are women who, from the beginning, right, rejected racism as well as sexism as factors, features relevant to American politics. They are our foremothers. And I think we have an opportunity this year to hold them up and to honor them, because they, more so than, unfortunately, many other American suffragists, really fully embody the kinds of values that are our values in the 21st century.
Yeah, and I just want to give a shout out to Preservation Maryland, because they have been doing great work in both research and in preserving the 2 houses where the Progressive Club of Baltimore, the African American Suffrage Organization, met. And Mrs. Chazelle, who kept working to educate Black women voters after the 1920. And there was a beautiful ceremony that I was able to attend, and some of you were possibly there, dedicating the historical marker. So we're beginning. I think one of the great opportunities of the centennial is to grapple with some of these questions, but also it's encouraging research to bring out these stories, because they were not as well known. They were not, the material was not necessarily in the National Archives. It was in the church records, and it was in the Black Women's Club's records. And so it takes extra research in some cases, and luckily scholars like Martha are doing that and bringing out those stories. So it complicates and it enriches this narrative that we got in this very narrow idea. I mean, the 6-volume history of women's suffrage, which I know I have it on my computer. I mean, I use it all the time, but Alice Paul isn't mentioned in it either. You know, it's a very limited view, and we were taking those limited views, and now we've got to make it much broader and more inclusive. So I think it's a great opportunity.
My name is Diana Conway. I'm the president of the Women's Democratic Club in Montgomery County, and I'm too tall for this microphone. But I'm asking a question. A number of you referred to the fact that we need to continue to make progress. One of the bills in Annapolis this year on which we can make progress is a pre-release center for women who are being prepared to be released from incarceration. You can imagine the socioeconomic profile of most of these women. There are currently 9 such facilities for men, and there are 0 state freestanding facilities for women. That is an equal rights protection issue. That is a federal and state constitutional issue. As we were walking this bill around today, everybody said, Kerwin, 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 got to take care of the children. The children of these women are exactly who the Kerwin Commission plan is designed to assist. So it is my hope that everyone who, within sound of my voice, will consider supporting the legislation for a pre-release center for women so that they can learn to use computers and learn how to get housing and have it in a place where they can reconnect with their children. So when they come out, they have jobs, they have housing, they have community support, they have been counseled, and it will work with Kerwin as Senator Mary Washington and Delegate Charlotte Crutchfield. Thank you.
On that note, I don't know that there's a response from you for that, but I want to thank you for this, and I imagine you do too.
I will say that that's one of the bipartisan issues that I believe our caucus either has or will be supporting. So that's it's always good when we have something that's important and we can agree. Thank you so much for being here. I think everybody really enjoyed it, and I want to give a last round of applause. And
Oh my goodness. Oh, lovely.
Careful, I don't think it's too bad.
Thank you. Thank you. There's a wonderful photograph of after the 19th Amendment was passed and all the shenanigans in Tennessee are settled or almost settled. Carrie Chapman Catt, the president of the National Association, comes to New York, which is her home, and she is greeted by a parade of women, of suffragists who come to the station and greet her. And she's given a bouquet of flowers. You can see it in pictures. I have it in the book, actually. It's the most gigantic, I mean, she can barely hold it. And but it has a sash on it, and it was actually inscribed by Tiffany's. I didn't quite understand how that happened, but it says, "To Mrs. Carrie Chapman Catt, from the enfranchised women of America." So, to you, the elected officials of America too.